Hello everyone, thank you for joining this session. My name is Chen Hong Gui from the University of New South Wales. I'm here representing a team of different educators from various different institutions, including Ellie Quinlan from ACAP, Josephine Paparo from Macquarie University, Frank Dean from University of Wollongong. And today I'll be presenting to you a benchmarking exercise that we did with postgraduate psychology placement logbooks. In terms of the background of this benchmarking exercise, all postgraduate psychology training programs are reviewed and accredited by the Australian Psychology Accreditation Council, or APAC. APAC requires all psychology postgraduate programs to have a placement logbook. This is where the trainees or the candidates record all placement activities, including direct client hours, supervision, and other client hours. Based on anecdotal information and also some very limited research internationally and in Australia, there's a great suggestion that there's a fair bit of variability in terms of placement setups and experiences, and also in terms of how the record keeping processes between the different programs, including the definition of hours, of how these are actually considered across different programs. There's a fair bit of variation around that. In terms of functionality of logbooks, most programs probably think of logbooks as purely a accounting or a record keeping process to ensure that there's proper oversight of what trainees are doing on placement. But some programs or some colleagues also consider the logbooks to be an important pedagogical aspect. There's a training, there's a value in terms of providing education and training or contributing to at least the growth and development of trainees' competencies. In terms of this particular benchmarking project, we reached out to placement coordinators and directors of psychology training clinics and asked them to actually send us a copy of their placement logbook templates. And in the end, there were 40 postgraduate psychology programs who responded from 27 education providers. The largest number of program types was the clinical program, which is not surprising because that is the largest number of postgraduate psychology programs around, and then including others are MPP and other areas of practice endorsement. One limitation for this benchmarking project is that not all areas of practice endorsement are actually represented, especially areas like education and development. So in terms of the results, what we did was we looked at each logbook template and looked at how the data is actually collected within each logbook template. So we looked at what type of information that's been collected, whether there's specific fields, whether certain types of information are further drilled down, and I'm going to take you through the results that we found. In terms of general information, there was pretty much great consistency in terms of all logbooks will have required a date of the activity, the duration of the activity itself, a tally of some sort that calculates the total of placement hours, and also there's a space for trainees to input activity description, what is the specific activity. Time of activity, only a small number of programs actually looked at having time of activity in addition to the date itself, so suggesting that probably date itself is sufficient. In terms of direct client hours, now I'll take you through this part by part. If you look at the bottom of the table, is aggregated. This means that in the placement logbook itself, there's some way to actually put in a total direct client hours. Now this means that it does not necessarily include a drill down, whether it's individual, whether it's divided into individual work or group work, for example, or whether it's adult or child, whether it's psychometrics and so on and so forth. Now, the aggregated field means that there's a field, that there's a total, but it doesn't mean that that particular logbook doesn't include a drill down. So it could be either or both. So if you look at the data itself, there's probably about a number of programs, about 42.5%, whereby they actually differentiate between individual and group, and then the others differentiate between adult versus child, psychometrics, whether it's telehealth or e-therapy or other types of work. So as you can see, there's probably a little bit of a fair bit of variation in terms of how this particular data is collected. By far, majority of them have at least a total count of direct client hours, but in terms of how specifically it's been broken down, apart from individual versus group, then the others are probably a fair bit of variation. Some programs also have a specific field for simulated client work, especially for MPP programs. Again, it's not surprising for MPP programs because for those program types, simulated client work is actually counted as a way of accruing direct client hours. In terms of further drill down into direct client hours, so we're looking at how much information is collected about the client itself. You can again see there's a fair bit of variation here, but about 50 to 70% of them include things like presenting issues, work conducted, but in terms of age, whether gender, the type of client, whether it's adult, child client, information like that. There's again a fair bit of variation there. Supervision hours. So there's a good agreement between the different programs, logbooks, in terms of differentiating between individual versus group supervision. And this probably follows through from the requirement of APEC to specifically look at the ratios of individual versus group supervision. Other client-related hours. Majority of programs actually, well, really all programs have an aggregate field for other client-related hours. Some specifically report on whether a particular activity is being observed by a supervisor. There's a particular field for that. And there are also some programs whereby there are professional development activities are actually specifically recorded as well. This again usually relates to MPP programs because my understanding is that MPP programs use the APRA-based logbooks, whereby there's a requirement for professional development activities to be included in the logs as well. In terms of other information that's captured in logbooks, you can see again there's a fair bit of variation, but it's interesting to see that about 32% of logbooks that we looked at had spaces for trainees to actually log their reflections about a particular activity or a particular period of time. So this varies a fair bit. Some programs require trainees to actually write reflections per entry. So each entry they write, they have to write something or thoughts around that. Some of them, of the templates require trainees to write a reflection at the end of the day, for example, or for end of the week. But there's a field for them to specifically write their thoughts or what was their challenges that they went through, experiences that they may have as part of the reflective process. And there are also some logbooks that require, in addition to writing down how many hours of supervision, they require a summary of the supervision discussion itself. And there are also other logbooks whereby they require specifically for the trainees to link each activity that they've logged with a particular professional competency. So this is making it deliberate in terms of linking what they're doing with the cultivation or the development of their professional competencies. In terms of the verification process, we can see that all logbooks require a supervisor signature, which is great. There's a lot of consistency there for sure. And interestingly, only about 45% of logbooks require the trainees to actually have a signature or have initials there or some verification of some sort. This suggests that perhaps the onus or the responsibility to verify or to actually declare that a particular logbook is a true and accurate reflection of the trainee's placement work seems to fall on the supervisor, given that the supervisor is the one that's signing it and not necessarily the trainees are actually signing off or provide some declaration around their logbook entries. In terms of frequency of supervisor signature, we found that probably the most common is weekly that the supervisor has to sign. Logbook format, as you can see, Excel spreadsheets are probably the most commonly used, and it's interesting to see that specialized softwares account for about 20% of the logbooks that we've seen. In my correspondence with various colleagues when they've actually submitted their logbooks for this benchmarking study, they've actually informed me that they're actually moving to a specialized software. So they might tell me that this Excel spreadsheet is currently what we're using, but we're actually going to be transitioning to a specialized software like In Place or Time to Track or something like that very soon. So I'll assume that percentage of programs using specialized softwares will keep increasing into the future. In terms of logbook training, majority of logbook templates have some basic instructions embedded within the template itself. So it includes definitions or some reminders as to putting the right things in the right columns. Some programs actually have specific documentation that speaks to the logbook itself. And a few of them will also provide specific training sessions around the use of the logbooks. So overall reflections and future considerations. Based on the benchmarking study, we actually see that primarily programs tend to use logbooks to serve as more an accounting or record keeping tool. And this is probably directly mapping onto APAC requirements as to having an oversight role of logbooks. Programs tend to be capturing the minimum amount of data that's required, and it's been largely based on what is actually occurring during the placement itself. And thinking about the future and looking at the various different comparisons, perhaps the logbook itself, the logbook process itself can be expanded to further increase pedagogical value. The one that really stands out to me is to do with trainee reflections. There's a way of getting trainees to think and therefore having a little bit more of educational value around that, or giving them an opportunity to link what they're actually doing with the development of their professional competencies. It also suggests from this benchmarking study that there's actually a significant variability in terms of the logbooks between the different programs, what information is captured, how detailed it is actually drilled down into. So in terms of both the what and how information was recorded, there's a fair bit of variability, suggesting that perhaps it's important for us as a field to consider the standardization of practicum logbooks and the processes. This just helps to increase confidence in terms of how we're all doing. We are all meant to be doing the same thing, whether we're doing it in a way that's fairly standardized. This will probably be helpful going into the future. And in terms of the benchmarking study that I've actually presented today, this is actually published this year in the Australian Psychologist. In the manuscript itself, it provides much more details in terms of the findings, some of the reflections and discussions around that. I'm happy to be contacted via email if you've got any questions, or if you'd like a copy of the manuscript, feel free to reach out. My email address is there. And thank you for joining this session.